The blizzard had been howling for 11 days straight when Callum MacLeod finally opened his door to check on his neighbors. While every other cabin in the settlement had fires burning day and night, smoke pouring from chimneys as families burned through their winter wood stores in desperation, Callum's half-buried metal shelter hadn't needed stoking in over a week. Before we see how one man's strange obsession with earth and heat changed frontier survival forever, let us know where you're watching from. And if you appreciate stories of forgotten innovation, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The wind screamed across the Montana Territory with a fury that turned breath to ice crystals before they could leave a man's lips. Callum MacLeod stood in the doorway of his half-buried shelter, watching smoke rise from chimneys across the scattered settlement. 11 days the blizzard had raged. 11 days of wind that could strip flesh from bone and cold that turned spit solid before it hit the ground. He pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the wall of white. The nearest cabin belonged to the Hoffmans, a family of 5 who had arrived last spring. Callum could barely see their structure through the driving snow, though it sat less than 200 yards from his own dwelling. He pushed through drifts that reached his waist, following the path he had packed down during his last check 3 days earlier. The path had filled in completely. When he reached the Hoffman cabin, he found Wilhelm standing outside, axe in hand, splitting frozen wood with desperate intensity. The man's beard was caked with ice. His eyes held the hollow look of exhaustion that came from too many nights without real sleep. "How's your supply holding?" Callum shouted over the wind. Wilhelm stopped mid-swing. "Burning through 2 cords a week just to keep the children from freezing. Got maybe 4 days left if this doesn't break." He stared at Callum with a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Resentment, perhaps. "Heard you haven't burned anything in over a week." Callum nodded. "The heat holds. The earth stores it." "Still seems like witchcraft," Wilhelm muttered, turning back to his wood. "Metal and dirt keeping a man warm while good Christian cabins freeze." Callum didn't argue. He had heard worse over the past year since completing his shelter. He continued his rounds, checking on the other families. The Johnsons were rationing their wood, keeping the fire low, and huddling together for warmth. The Carmichaels had taken to burning furniture. Young Thomas Reed had moved his family into their barn with the livestock for shared heat. And then there was Donal Rafferty. Callum found him trying to split frozen logs with numbed hands, cursing with each failed strike. Rafferty had been the loudest critic of Callum's construction project, calling it MacLeod's folly, predicting the metal shelter would be an icebox come winter, claiming any fool knew proper cabins were built from good timber with proper joints and solid craftsmanship. "Need help?" Callum offered. "Need you to take your damned smugness elsewhere," Rafferty snarled. "Some of us built real homes. Some of us didn't bury ourselves like animals." Callum studied the man for a moment, then nodded and turned back toward his shelter. Behind him, he heard Rafferty's axe strike wood again, the sound sharp and desperate in the endless wind. The settlement hadn't always been this way, hadn't always been filled with this particular mixture of desperation and resentment. That had started with Fergus. 14 months earlier, the Montana Territory had seemed almost welcoming. February of 1839 brought cold, but the kind of cold a man could manage with a good fire and adequate shelter. Callum MacLeod and Fergus O'Malley had spent that winter trapping beaver along the tributaries feeding into the Missouri River, their small cabin serving as base camp for their operation. They had built the cabin together the previous autumn. Single-room construction, notched log corners, mud chinking. A stone fireplace that Fergus had insisted on despite the extra work. The cabin was typical of frontier construction, assembled in just under a week using timber from the surrounding hillsides. It kept out most of the wind and stayed tolerably warm when the fire burned steady. Fergus was Irish, 10 years older than Callum, and had been trapping these mountains for nearly 15 years. He knew the country, knew the beaver patterns, knew which creeks would produce and which were trapped out. Callum had partnered with him 2 seasons back, learning the trade from a man who understood wilderness survival with the kind of practical wisdom that kept a man alive. On February 19th, Fergus left at dawn to check their northern trap line. The traps were set along a creek about 4 miles from the cabin, a route Fergus could walk in under 2 hours. The morning was cold, but clear. Callum stayed behind to process pelts they had collected the previous day, scraping hides and stretching them on willow frames to dry. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped noticeably. By evening, Callum realized something was wrong. Fergus should have returned hours earlier. The wind had picked up, bringing the kind of penetrating cold that seemed to find every gap in a man's clothing. Callum waited until full dark, feeding the fire, watching the door. When Fergus still hadn't appeared, he loaded his rifle, wrapped himself in every layer he owned, and headed north. He found Fergus 300 yards from the cabin. The older man had made it back within sight of home. He lay in the snow near the woodpile, one hand still reaching toward the cabin door. The door itself was sealed shut by a thick layer of ice where moisture from inside had frozen solid against the frame. Fergus had tried to force it. The scratches in the ice and disturbed snow told the story. Clearly enough, unable to get inside, caught in the sudden temperature drop without adequate shelter, Fergus had succumbed to exposure within minutes of reaching safety. His rifle lay beside him. His pack still contained the beaver pelts he had collected that morning. Everything had been fine until that final barrier, that frozen door between him and warmth. Callum carried the body inside after breaking through the ice seal with his axe. He laid Fergus on the sleeping platform and sat beside him through the night, feeding the fire that would have saved his partner's life if only the door had opened. 3 days later, when the ground thawed enough to dig, Callum buried Fergus on a rise overlooking the creek where they had trapped together. Callum stayed in the cabin for 2 weeks after the burial, continuing to work the trap lines alone, processing the remaining pelts from their season. But something had changed in how he saw the structure around him. The cabin that had seemed adequate now felt like a trap itself, a fragile shell between survival and death. He began studying the fire, how quickly the heat dissipated when the flames died down, how the interior temperature would drop 30 degrees in under an hour if the fire went out, how constant feeding was required to maintain even basic warmth. The cabin was not a shelter that held heat. It was merely a temporary barrier that worked only as long as fuel kept burning. Fergus had died because of a frozen door, but the deeper problem was that the cabin required such constant fire that moisture from cooking, breathing, and living had no way to escape except through cracks and gaps. That moisture had frozen solid on the coldest surfaces, including the door frame. The very design that allowed heat to escape so readily had created the ice barrier that killed his partner. Callum started visiting other cabins in the scattered settlement that had formed over the past 2 years. Homesteaders, trappers, a few families trying to establish farms in the mountain valleys. Everyone built the same way: notched logs, mud chinking, stone or mud fireplaces, maybe a small window covered with oiled paper or scraped hide. Some cabins were better built than others, but all shared the same fundamental problem. They bled heat constantly. He talked to men about how much wood they burned. The answers were staggering. A family of 4 might burn through 3 full cords of wood each month during deep winter. That meant someone had to spend enormous amounts of time cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking fuel. Children were kept busy feeding fires. Women rose multiple times each night to add logs. The entire rhythm of winter life revolved around combating heat loss. When Callum asked why no one built differently, the answers were always the same. This was how cabins were built. This was how it had always been done. Log construction was proven, reliable, understood. Any other approach was untested and therefore dangerous. But Callum could not stop thinking about the fundamental inefficiency. All that labor, all that fuel, all that constant attention, and still cabins were barely warm enough to survive in. Still, moisture froze on doors. Still, people died when fires went out or wood supplies ran short. There had to be a better method, some way to build shelter that held heat instead of surrendering it to every gust of wind. Some principle of construction that worked with warmth instead of fighting a constant losing battle against cold. Spring came slowly to Montana Territory. Callum spent March and early April trapping alone, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself studying not just cabins, but every structure, every shelter, every space where temperature remained different from the surrounding air. Root cellars fascinated him most. Nearly every homestead had one, a hole dug into a hillside or straight down into earth, lined with stone or logs, covered with a thick layer of soil. Families stored potatoes, turnips, carrots, apples, anything that needed to stay cool but not freeze. The cellars worked remarkably well. Food placed in them in October would still be fresh in April. Callum began taking measurements. He borrowed a thermometer from Wilhelm Hofmann, a German homesteader who had brought the instrument from St. Louis. On a day when the outside air temperature sat at 75 degrees, Callum measured the temperature inside Hoffmann's root cellar at 52 degrees. 2 weeks later, when a late cold snap dropped the outside temperature to 28 degrees, the root cellar measured 49 degrees. The earth itself was maintaining temperature, not perfectly stable, but far more consistent than the air above it. Callum dug a test hole on his own land, going down 6 feet. He placed the thermometer at the bottom and checked it daily for 2 weeks. The temperature varied only between 48 and 52 degrees, regardless of whether the surface was experiencing warm spring sun or cold nighttime frost. He consulted with an old French trapper named Baptiste, who had spent time in the far north. Baptiste told him about how some tribes built winter homes partially underground, using earth as insulation against brutal cold. The structures were not fully buried, but bermed with soil, dug into hillsides, covered with sod roofs. They required less fire than surface dwellings. Callum traveled to Fort Benton in May, ostensibly to sell his furs, but really to observe construction. He spent days watching builders work on warehouses and storage buildings. He paid attention to how stone foundations distributed weight, how thick walls retained cool temperatures even during hot days, how buildings partially set into hillsides seemed more stable than those built entirely above ground. An idea was forming, not fully developed, but taking shape. What if a dwelling could use Earth's constant temperature not as cold storage, but as a heat reservoir? What if a structure could be built to absorb warmth and release it slowly, the way root cellars maintained coolness? What if the very soil that kept vegetables from freezing could be made to keep people warm? Callum returned to Fort Benton in late June. The trading post had grown considerably over the past year, serving as a hub for trappers, traders, and the occasional military detachment moving through the territory. The fort itself was a rough collection of log buildings surrounding a central square where merchants set up temporary stalls to sell goods hauled upriver from St. Louis. Most men came to the fort to buy standard supplies, powder and lead for rifles, coffee and salt and sugar, cloth and needles for mending, axes and knives when their own wore out. Callum wandered through the stalls with no particular goal, simply observing what was available, what people considered valuable enough to transport hundreds of miles into the wilderness. He found the metal structure behind the Army's storage warehouse, half hidden under canvas tarps weighted down with rocks. A soldier was trying to organize supplies and kept cursing the metal sections for taking up space. Callum asked what it was. "Quonset shelter," the soldier said, "corrugated metal panels that bolt together into an arch. Army brought it up 2 years ago for temporary storage. Thing leaked at the seams. Wind tore half the panels loose last winter, and the lieutenant decided it was more trouble than it was worth. Been trying to sell it for 6 months." Callum pulled back the tarp. The panels were indeed damaged. Some had bent edges. Others showed rust spots where the protective coating had worn through. But the basic material was sound. heavy gauge metal, corrugated for strength, formed into curved sections that could be assembled into a semi-cylindrical structure. Each panel was roughly 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. "How much?" Callum asked. The soldier looked surprised anyone was interested. Lieutenant said, "Get $20 for the lot if someone's fool enough to want it. Otherwise it's getting left here when we move out next month." $20 was a significant sum, more than Callum had made from his entire spring trapping season. But he could see what the soldier could not. The curved shape would support weight from above. The metal was waterproof. The panels, even damaged, could be assembled into a structure that would not rot, would not burn, and could be partially buried without collapsing. "I need to think on it," Callum said. He spent the next day calculating. He had $37 saved, money he had been holding for supplies, and next year's trapping equipment. $20 would leave him 17, barely enough for basic necessities, but standard building materials would cost nearly as much. Logs required weeks of cutting and hauling. A proper cabin needed several hundred board feet of lumber for floors and roof, and lumber cost dearly in the territory. The metal. Shelter was damaged, true, but metal could be patched. Bent panels could be straightened or worked around. And most importantly, the structure was already designed to be curved and load-bearing. It was, in essence, a ready-made shell that could serve as the core of an earth-sheltered dwelling. On his third day at the fort, Callum found the soldier again. "I'll take it, $20. The soldier accepted the money with obvious relief. "You'll need to move it yourself. We're not hauling it anywhere." Callum spent the next week disassembling the structure, cataloging panels, sorting hardware, and bundling everything for transport. Other trappers and traders watched with amusement. Metal belonged in tools and weapons, not buildings. The idea of constructing a dwelling from curved metal panels seemed absurd, wasteful, impractical. The distance from Fort Benton to Callum's land was roughly 80 miles, following the river valleys and established trails. Under normal circumstances, a man could make the journey in 5 or 6 days on horseback. But Callum was not traveling light. He had purchased the metal panels, bolts, and framework that comprised the disassembled Quonset shelter. The total weight exceeded 600 pounds. He owned one horse, a sturdy mare named Whiskey, who could carry perhaps 200 pounds of cargo comfortably. Multiple trips would be necessary. Callum constructed a simple travois, 2 long poles lashed together with crosspieces that Whiskey could drag behind her. He could load perhaps 150 pounds on the travois without overtaxing the horse. That meant 4 trips minimum to move everything, not counting his own supplies and equipment. He made the first journey in early July, 8 days to his land with a load of panels and hardware, 2 days to unload and organize, 8 days back to the fort. On his second trip, he encountered Wilhelm Hoffman heading to Fort Benton with his own wagon. "Heard you bought that army scrap metal," Wilhelm said. "What exactly are you planning?" "Building a shelter," Callum replied. Wilhelm studied the travois loaded with curved metal panels. "That's not lumber. That's not even proper building material. You planning to live in a metal tube?" "Planning to build something that holds heat better than logs," Callum said. Wilhelm shook his head. "Heat comes from fire, McLeod, not from whatever strange idea you've got in mind, but you always were peculiar." He continued toward the fort, leaving Callum to his hauling. The summer heat made travel miserable. Temperatures in the Missouri River Valley could reach 90 degrees by midday. Callum traveled in early morning and late evening, resting during the worst heat. Whiskey tolerated the work but grew increasingly irritable with each trip. By the third journey, word had spread through the scattered homesteads about McLeod's metal building project. When Callum passed Thomas Reed's cabin, Reed came out to watch. "You're wasting your time." "And money," Reed called out. "That metal will be an oven in summer and an icebox in winter. Metal doesn't insulate worth a damn." "Won't be relying on the metal for insulation," Callum said, not stopping. "Then what's the point of hauling it all that way?" Callum did not answer. He was tired of explaining concepts that most men could not grasp. The metal was not meant to insulate. It was meant to provide structure, to be waterproof, to support weight from above. The insulation would come from Earth itself. The fourth and final trip took place in early August. By the time Callum hauled the last load of panels and hardware to his land, he had spent nearly a month on transportation alone. His savings were reduced to $9. His horse was exhausted. And his homestead now contained a pile of damaged military surplus metal that everyone agreed was worthless for construction purposes. Callum began organizing the panels, sorting them by condition, planning assembly. He had selected his building site weeks earlier during the first trip. A south-facing hillside with good drainage and clear sight lines. Now it was time to begin actual construction. Callum stood on the hillside he had selected and began marking the foundation perimeter. The structure would measure 16 feet wide and 24 feet long, oriented with the entrance facing south to catch winter sun. The back would nestle into the hillside itself, using the slope as natural berming. He started digging in mid-August. The work was brutal. Montana soil at this elevation mixed clay, rocks, and hardpan that required a pickaxe to break through. Callum excavated the back third of the structure first, cutting into the hillside to create a level platform. He went down 3 feet, then began building up. The earthen berm would be the key to thermal mass. Callum had studied adobe construction during his time at Fort Benton, watching Mexican traders who understood building with earth. The principle was simple but labor-intensive. Mix clay-rich soil with water and a binding material, form it into blocks, let them dry in the sun, then stack them like masonry. Callum spent 2 weeks making bricks. He dug clay from a deposit near the creek, mixed it with water and dried grass for binding, packed the mixture into a wooden form that produced blocks roughly 8 inches by 12 inches by 4 inches thick. Each brick took 2 days to dry fully in the August heat. He needed over 400 bricks for his planned berm structure. While bricks dried, he continued excavation and site preparation. He dug drainage channels around the perimeter to direct water away from the foundation. He hauled rocks from the creek to create a gravel base that would prevent moisture wicking up into the earthen walls. Every decision was made with an understanding that water was the enemy of earth construction. Donald Rafferty rode past one afternoon and stopped to watch Callum stacking sun-dried mud bricks. "You've lost your mind entirely, McLeod. First metal panels, now mud blocks. Why not just build a proper cabin like a Christian?" "Proper cabins burn through cords of wood and still freeze," Callum said, not looking up from his work. "That's what winter is. That's what survival costs. A man tends his fire and accepts the work. Or a man builds shelter that doesn't waste heat in the first place." Rafferty laughed. "You're going to freeze to death in that metal tomb come December, and the rest of us will have a good story about the fool who thought he was smarter than everyone who came before him." He rode off, still laughing. Callum continued building. The berm rose slowly, a U-shaped wall of adobe brick that would cradle the metal structure. He built it 3 feet high at the front, gradually increasing to 6 feet at the rear, where it merged into the hillside. The total mass of earth in the berm exceeded 8 tons. By mid-September, the berm was complete. Callum had created a raised platform with substantial thermal mass, earth that could absorb heat and release it slowly. The structure would sit within this earthen embrace, protected from wind, insulated by thousands of pounds of soil, connected to the constant temperature of the ground itself. Now came the challenge of assembling the metal shell over this foundation, creating the waterproof exterior that would allow him to pile even more earth over the top without collapse. The Quonset panels had been designed for quick military assembly, each section bolted to the next along reinforced edges, creating a self-supporting arch when properly erected. The Army manual that came with the hardware claimed 4 men could assemble the structure in 6 hours. Callum was one man working alone. The assembly took him 11 days. He started at the front, bolting the entrance frame to wooden posts he had sunk into the earthen berm. The frame included a doorway opening and space for a small window. From this anchor point, he began attaching the curved metal panels, working backward toward the hillside. Each panel weighed approximately 40 pounds and was awkward to maneuver into position. Callum built a simple wooden scaffolding that let him prop panels at the correct angle while he climbed up to bolt them in place. The corrugated metal was strong but flexible. He had to ensure proper alignment or the entire structure would twist out of true. The damaged panels presented challenges. Some had bent edges that no longer mated flush with adjacent sections. Callum used his hammer to straighten what he could, and when that failed, he overlapped sections and added extra bolts to create weatherproof seams. The result was not pretty, but it was functional. By the end of the first week, he had erected the front half of the structure. The metal arch rose from the earthen berm like a giant barrel lying on its side. The back half went faster because he could work from inside, bracing panels against the hillside as he bolted them together. When the final panel was secured, Callum stood inside his creation. The interior measured 14 feet wide at the base and 8 feet high at the peak of the arch. The metal shell enclosed roughly 300 square feet of space. Curved walls eliminated corners where heat could stagnate. The arch shape distributed weight evenly along the entire length. But the shell was just the beginning. Callum began the critical work of integrating the metal structure with earth insulation. He packed soil against the exterior, building up layers that covered the lower 2/3 of the curved walls. He tamped the earth firmly, creating continuous contact between metal and soil. At the rear, where the structure met the hillside, he extended the earthen coverage even higher, berming soil up and over the back portion of the arch. The metal disappeared under tons of packed earth, creating a seamless transition between the man-made structure and the natural slope. The front entrance remained exposed, facing south. Callum built a simple wooden door frame and constructed a door from thick planks he had hewn from pine logs. The door would not be fancy, but it would seal tightly. He added a small window opening beside the door, roughly 12 inches square. He covered it temporarily with oiled paper until he could devise something better. For the roof, Callum faced a decision. He could leave the exposed metal as weatherproofing, but metal conducted heat readily, creating temperature loss through radiation. Instead, he began hauling soil up and over the top of the arch, piling earth 6 inches deep along the entire exposed length. Over the soil, he laid sections of sod he had cut from meadowgrass near the creek. The living roof would insulate, would shed water, and would help the structure blend into the hillside. Within 2 years, the grass would root fully, creating a continuous green covering indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. October arrived with cool nights and the first hints of coming winter. Callum worked with increasing urgency to complete the details that would determine whether his shelter succeeded or failed. The metal shell and earthen berming were complete. Now came refinement. He started with the entrance. The wooden door he had built was adequate, but needed weatherproofing. Callum constructed a small covered porch extension, a simple roof supported by 2 posts that created a transitional space between outside and inside. This vestibule would serve as an airlock, preventing wind from blowing directly into the main shelter when the door opened. Around the doorframe, he packed additional clay mixed with dried grass, creating a flexible seal that would accommodate the wood's seasonal expansion and contraction. He carved a groove around the door's edge and fitted it with strips of leather to create a compression seal when closed. The window required more thought. Glass was unavailable and too expensive, regardless. Oiled paper would last 1 season at most. Callum needed something transparent enough to allow light but durable enough to survive years of weather and temperature extremes. He settled on a double-layer system. For the outer layer, He stretched scraped deer hide across the opening. The hide was translucent when properly thinned, allowing diffused light through while blocking wind. For the inner layer, he created a wooden shutter that could be opened for ventilation or closed for insulation. Between the hide and shutter, he left a 2-inch air gap that would serve as additional insulation. Inside the shelter, Callum built his heating system. Most cabins used large fireplaces that consumed vast amounts of wood. Callum designed something different. He constructed a small masonry heater using stones gathered from the creek. The heater measured only 3 feet square, but incorporated principles he had observed in German homesteads. The firebox was small, designed to burn hot fires for short periods. The exhaust gases passed through internal channels in the stonework, transferring heat to the thermal mass of the stone before exiting through a chimney. The stone would absorb heat during burning and radiate it for hours afterward. He positioned the heater centrally, so heat would distribute evenly throughout the interior. The chimney extended up through the earthen roof, with the pipe surrounded by rocks and clay to prevent heat loss and create additional thermal mass. Callum built a sleeping platform along one curved wall, raised 18 inches off the floor. Beneath it, he created storage for food and supplies. He constructed a simple table and 2 benches. He added shelves along the walls for equipment. The final touch was insulation around the exposed entrance wall. Callum had been gathering dried vegetation throughout September, cattails from wetlands near the creek, dried grass from meadows, leaves from cottonwood groves. He bundled this material and packed it between the metal exterior and an inner wall he constructed from willow branches woven into panels. The dried vegetation created dead air space, vastly superior to solid materials for preventing heat transfer. He covered the willow panels with clay plaster to protect the organic insulation from moisture and pests. By late October, the shelter was complete enough to occupy. Callum moved his possessions from the old cabin he had shared with Fergus and spent his first night in the earth-sheltered structure. The experience was immediately different from any cabin he had known. The silence struck him first. Above-ground cabins transmitted every sound: wind against logs, branches scraping roofs, animals moving outside. The earth-bermed shelter muffled everything. The quiet was profound, almost unsettling initially. Temperature behavior was equally distinct. As evening temperatures dropped into the 30s, Callum built a small fire in his masonry heater. He burned only 4 split logs, letting them burn hot and fast for roughly 90 minutes. Then he closed the firebox and damped the chimney to retain heat in the stonework. He placed his borrowed thermometer on the table and monitored interior temperature through the night. When the fire died down around 8 o'clock, the interior measured 68 degrees. By midnight, it had dropped to 64 degrees. By dawn, when outside temperature had fallen to 26 degrees, the interior still registered 59 degrees. A standard log cabin would have lost 30 degrees or more in the same time frame without continuous fire. Callum's shelter had lost only 9 degrees despite no active heating for 10 hours. The earthen walls, the thermal mass of the berm, and the minimal exposed surface area were performing exactly as he had theorized. Over the following weeks, Callum experimented systematically. He tested different fire durations. He monitored temperature variations between floor and ceiling. He measured the rate of heat loss under various wind conditions. He tracked how many logs he burned compared to his previous consumption. The data confirmed his design. The shelter required roughly 1/5 the firewood of a conventional cabin to maintain comfortable temperature. More importantly, the heating pattern was entirely different. Instead of constant fire tending, Callum could burn a hot fire once each evening. The thermal mass absorbed the heat and released it gradually through the night. He began understanding the system's subtleties. The earthen berm was not just insulation, it was a heat battery. When he burned his evening fire, heat radiated from the masonry heater into the interior air, but also conducted into the earth walls surrounding the space. The walls warmed slowly, then released that warmth back into the living space over many hours. The constant 50-degree temperature of the ground 6 feet down created a baseline. The shelter never dropped below about 48 degrees, even if he burned no fire for several days, because the earth itself maintained minimum temperature. In a conventional cabin, interior temperature would match exterior temperature within hours of a fire dying. The metal shell's role became clear through his testing. It was not insulation, but a waterproof membrane that allowed earth coverage without moisture infiltration. The corrugated shape provided structural strength to support tons of soil, while the material itself contributed nothing to thermal performance. The actual temperature control came entirely from earth mass and strategic design. Callum documented everything, taking notes on paper he had purchased at Fort Benton. Someday, these observations might prove useful to others. November brought the first significant snowfall. 6 inches accumulated overnight, blanketing the settlement and transforming the landscape into white silence. Callum woke to find his shelter barely visible from a distance. The earthen roof, covered with sod, had accumulated, snow that made the structure blend completely into the hillside. Only the entrance, with its small porch and the thin line of smoke from his chimney, indicated human habitation. He spent the morning walking the settlement, observing how others were preparing for winter. Wilhelm Hoffman had stacked 8 cords of split wood beside his cabin, enough for 3 months if consumption remained steady. Thomas Reed was adding additional chinking to his cabin walls, trying to seal gaps before deep cold arrived. The Johnsons had built a woodshed to keep their fuel supply dry. Everyone was preparing for the same brutal reality. Winter meant constant fire tending. It meant someone waking every few hours through the night to add logs. It meant children taught to maintain flames before they learned much else. It meant entire days spent cutting and splitting wood. The rhythm of frontier winter life revolved entirely around combustion. Callum returned to his shelter and burned his evening fire. 4 logs, 90 minutes of burning. Then silence and slowly radiating warmth through the night. Donald Rafferty arrived 3 days later, riding past on his way to Fort Benton for additional supplies. He stopped and stared at Callum's nearly invisible shelter. "Buried yourself proper, I see," Rafferty called out, "like a groundhog hiding from winter." Callum emerged from the entrance. "Groundhogs stay warm enough. Groundhogs sleep through winter. Men need fire. I have fire, just don't need it burning all day and night." Rafferty dismounted and approached closer, studying the structure with obvious skepticism. "You really think this mud and metal contraption will keep you alive when it's 40 below? You think you're smarter than everyone who's survived winters before you?" "I think most people do things the way they've always been done, without asking if there's a better method." "The better method is proven. Log cabins work. They've worked for hundreds of years. Your experiment here is going to end with you frozen solid, and the rest of us will have to dig your corpse out come spring." Rafferty remounted his horse. "I give you until January before you abandon this foolishness and ask to winter with a family that built proper shelter." He rode off toward the fort, shaking his head. Other settlers shared Rafferty's skepticism, though most expressed it less bluntly. The general consensus was that McLeod had wasted months of labor and most of his money building something that looked more like a grave than a home. The structure was strange, unprecedented, vaguely unsettling in how it seemed to hide in the earth rather than standing proudly above it. December arrived with steady cold. Temperatures dropped into the 20s during the day, single digits at night. The settlement's chimneys poured smoke constantly. Wood piles shrank visibly. Callum burned his small evening fires and monitored his fuel consumption. He was using perhaps half a cord per month, 1/6 of what his neighbors required. The cold intensified as December progressed. By mid-month, daytime temperatures struggled to reach 15 degrees. Nights dropped below 0 regularly. The settlement adapted with the resigned efficiency of people who understood winter's demands. More wood burned, more time spent splitting frozen logs, More nights with minimal sleep as fires required constant attention. Callum maintained his routine. Each evening around 6 o'clock he built his fire. 4 to 6 split logs depending on outside temperature. He burned them hot, achieving maximum heat transfer to his masonry heater's thermal mass. By 8 o'clock the fire was embers. By 9 it was ash. He closed the damper, sealed the firebox, and let thermal mass do its work. His interior temperature rarely dropped below 55 degrees overnight. Most mornings he woke to 60-degree air, despite outside temperatures near zero. The shelter required no fire tending during night hours. He slept uninterrupted. Wilhelm Hoffman stopped by one afternoon, curious despite his earlier skepticism. "Your chimney barely smokes. Either you're freezing or something unusual is happening." "Come inside," Callum offered. Wilhelm ducked through the entrance and stood in the shelter's interior, his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. The space was noticeably warm despite no visible fire. The masonry heater radiated gentle heat. The curved walls created an embracing feeling rather than the boxed-in sensation of cabins. "How is it this warm? I don't see a fire burning." "Burned one last night around 6. The stone holds heat and releases it slowly. The earth walls do the same." Wilhelm touched the interior wall, feeling the slight warmth radiating from packed earth beneath clay plaster. "This doesn't make sense. Heat should dissipate." "Heat does dissipate, but earth dissipates it slowly, much slower than air. A log cabin is mostly airspace between thin wooden walls. Heat escapes through every gap and through the wood itself. This shelter is surrounded by tons of earth that warm gradually and cool gradually." Wilhelm studied the structure with new appreciation. "How much wood are you burning?" "Maybe half a cord per month." "Half a cord? I'm burning 3 cords monthly, and my cabin still gets cold enough at night that water freezes in the bucket." "Because your cabin fights losing battle. You heat air, the air escapes, you heat more air. I heat mass. The mass stays warm." Wilhelm left, looking thoughtful. Over the following days he mentioned Callum's shelter to other settlers. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others became curious. A few asked to visit and see for themselves. Thomas Reed came by, examined the structure, and left shaking his head. "It's clever, I'll grant you, but it took you 4 months to build. I can put up a cabin in a week." "Your cabin will need replacing in 5 years and requires constant fire every day it stands. This will last decades and needs fire. Only once daily." "Maybe so, but most men can't afford 4 months of construction time." January 1840 arrived with atmospheric conditions that experienced frontiersmen recognized as ominous. The sky took on a peculiar pale color, neither blue nor gray, but something between. The air felt dense, heavy with moisture despite temperatures well below freezing. Birds disappeared from the area entirely. Horses grew nervous and restless without apparent cause. Callum had lived in Montana Territory long enough to understand these signs. A major weather system was building, something beyond the routine cold snaps and snowstorms of normal winter. He spent 2 days preparing. He brought in extra firewood and stacked it inside his small vestibule where it would stay dry and accessible. He checked his food supplies, confirming he had flour, dried beans, salt pork, and coffee enough for several weeks without needing to venture outside. He visited Wilhelm Hoffman and mentioned the warning signs. Wilhelm agreed something significant was coming, but felt his cabin was adequately prepared. 8 cords of wood remained stacked outside. His family had ample food stores. The cabin's chinking had been reinforced in November. "We'll burn through more wood than usual, but we'll manage," Wilhelm said. "Appreciate the concern, though." Callum stopped at Thomas Reed's homestead next. Reed was splitting wood in his yard, building up his supply. "Feel it in my bones," Reed said. "Something bad coming, getting ready for long cold. You might consider adding extra insulation to your walls if there's time. Even piling snow around the foundation will help." Reed paused his splitting and studied Callum. "You're that worried about it?" "The signs are clear. This won't be ordinary cold. Well, we've survived every winter so far. This one will pass too. Reed returned to his splitting, dismissing, further discussion. Callum saved Donal Rafferty's place for last, partly because Rafferty lived farthest from the other homesteads, partly because he expected hostile reception. He found Rafferty repairing his cabin's roof where wind had damaged the bark covering. "Come to gloat about your buried fortress?" Rafferty called down from his ladder. "Came to suggest you might want to add insulation before the storm hits. The atmospheric signs indicate severe cold coming." Rafferty climbed down and faced Callum directly. "Let me understand this. You, living in your metal hole in the ground, are giving me advice about surviving winter in a proper cabin. I've lived through 15 Montana winters. I know what I'm doing." "Your cabin loses heat rapidly. If this storm is as severe as conditions suggest, you'll burn through your entire wood supply trying to stay warm. Then I'll cut more wood. That's what men do. We don't hide underground like animals, hoping the earth will keep us warm through some magical principle you think you've discovered. I'm offering to help you prepare. Add a berming around your foundation. Pack dried grass between your wall logs. Small improvements could make significant difference." Rafferty's expression hardened. "I don't need help from someone who's abandoned proper construction methods. My cabin is built right. It'll stand through whatever winter brings. Your metal tomb might keep you alive, or it might collapse and bury you. Either way, that's your concern, not mine." Callum nodded and left without further argument. He had made the offer. What others did with the warning was their choice. The storm hit on January 9th with a ferocity that exceeded even Callum's concerns. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. Wind rose from calm to sustained 40-mile-per-hour gusts with higher peaks. Snow began falling so thickly that visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Callum was inside his shelter when the front arrived. He felt the atmospheric pressure change, a physical sensation like something pressing against his ears. The wind hit with enough force that he heard it even through the earth-bermed walls, a deep roaring that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He built his evening fire earlier than usual, around 4 o'clock, burning 6 logs instead of his normal 4. The masonry heater absorbed the heat efficiently. By 6 o'clock, interior temperature had risen to 70 degrees. He closed the damper and let the thermal mass begin its slow radiation. Outside, the temperature continued falling. By midnight, it had reached 15 below zero. By dawn of the second day, 25 below. The wind never stopped. Snow accumulated in massive drifts that reshaped the landscape, burying fences, covering doorways, transforming familiar terrain into an alien white wasteland. Callum monitored his interior temperature carefully. Despite the extreme conditions outside, the shelter maintained remarkable stability. The overnight low was 58 degrees. By noon of the second day, with weak sunlight providing minimal solar gain through his small window, interior temperature climbed back to 62 degrees without any additional fire. The thermal mass was performing exactly as designed. The tons of earth surrounding his living space had been gradually warmed by months of small, daily fires. That stored heat was now serving as a buffer against the extreme cold, attempting to penetrate from outside. The Earth's baseline temperature of 50 degrees, combined with the residual warmth from recent fires, created a stable environment that the storm could not quickly overcome. On the third day, Callum burned another fire. 6 logs again, hot and fast. The stone heater absorbed the energy. Interior temperature peaked at 69 degrees, then began its gradual decline as the thermal mass radiated warmth through the following hours. He established a routine: monitor temperature. Burn fire every second or third day, depending on conditions. Maintain interior comfort while consuming minimal fuel. The storm raged outside with undiminished fury, but inside the earth-sheltered dwelling, life continued with relative normalcy. Callum read by candlelight. He mended clothes. He planned next season's trapping routes. He ate regular meals cooked on the residual heat of his masonry stove. He slept through entire nights without waking to tend fires. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening. Wind continued. Snow continued. Temperature remained brutally low. By day 5, Callum estimated outside temperature had reached 35 below zero. He had burned perhaps 12 logs total since the storm began. A conventional cabin would have consumed 10 times that amount just to maintain marginal habitability. Callum's neighbors were burning through their carefully accumulated wood stores at alarming rates, fighting a desperate battle against cold that penetrated every gap and crack in their above-ground structures. By day 7 of the blizzard, Callum made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone living in a conventional cabin. He stopped burning fires entirely. The experiment was partly scientific curiosity, partly confidence in his design, and partly practical conservation in case the storm lasted longer than his wood supply could support with regular burning. He monitored interior temperature carefully. When he made the decision, the shelter registered 64 degrees from his last fire 20 hours earlier. Over the next 12 hours, temperature dropped to 60 degrees. Over the following 12 hours, it declined further to 57 degrees. Then the decline slowed dramatically. At 57 degrees, the shelter's interior had nearly matched the baseline temperature of the Earth itself, 6 feet below the surface. The thermal mass, having released most of its stored heat from recent fires, was now simply maintaining equilibrium with the surrounding ground temperature. 57 degrees was cool but livable. Callum wore a wool shirt and his leather coat indoors. He kept moving rather than sitting idle. He was comfortable enough to sleep without difficulty, though he added an extra blanket to his bedding. The crucial discovery was that the shelter could not drop below this baseline regardless of outside conditions. Even as the storm raged with temperatures 40 below zero and wind chills pushing 50 below, the earth-sheltered structure maintained 57 degrees with no active heating whatsoever. Outside, Callum's neighbors fought for survival. Log cabins with continuous fires struggled to maintain 40 degrees inside. Families huddled together for warmth. Children slept fully dressed under piles of blankets and furs. Every available scrap of wood was being fed into fireplaces that seemed to provide inadequate heat no matter how much fuel they consumed. The difference was fundamental physics. Cabins were boxes of thin wood surrounded by air that was 50 degrees colder than desired interior temperature. Heat generated by fires was attempting to warm that air, but the air was simultaneously losing heat through every surface. The battle was inherently losing. More fire only slowed the rate of heat loss. Callum's shelter was surrounded by tons of earth that had no significant temperature gradient with the surrounding ground. Heat loss was minimal because there was little temperature difference to drive it. The structure existed in thermal equilibrium with the earth, requiring only small amounts of additional heat to raise interior temperature above the baseline. On day 9, Callum burned another small fire. 4 logs, 90 minutes of burning. Interior temperature climbed to 68 degrees. The thermal mass absorbed some heat, and the surplus warmed the living space. Over the next 36 hours, temperature declined gradually back toward the baseline, but never dropped below 56 degrees. He had achieved something remarkable. During the most extreme weather conditions Montana Territory could produce, his shelter was maintaining livable temperature, with fires burned only every few days. His wood consumption was perhaps 1/10 that of conventional cabins, maybe less. The storm continued into its second week with no indication of weakening. Callum remained comfortable, conserving fuel, documenting temperatures, proving that his design worked under the most brutal possible test conditions. On day 11 of the blizzard, Callum heard knocking on his door. Not the gentle knock of a casual visitor, but the desperate pounding of someone in serious trouble. He opened the door to find Donald Rafferty, face raw from wind exposure, ice crusted in his beard, eyes showing the desperation of a man facing death. "Need help?" Rafferty gasped. barely able to speak through shivering. "Wood's nearly gone. Can't make it another day." Callum pulled him inside immediately. The temperature difference hit Rafferty visibly. His expression showed shock at finding warmth with no fire burning. "How is it warm in here?" "Sit down. Get feeling back in your extremities first." Callum heated water on the residual warmth of his masonry heater, which still radiated gentle heat from a fire burned 18 hours earlier. He made coffee and handed Rafferty the cup. Rafferty's hands shook so badly he could barely hold the vessel. "My cabin. Burned through almost 4 cords in 10 days. Got maybe 2 days of wood left if I'm careful. Temperature inside dropping to freezing even with fire going constantly. Thought I could make it, but this storm won't break." "How's your family?" "Sent them to the Hoffmans 3 days ago. Wilhelm's cabin is bigger. More people means shared warmth. I stayed to tend the fire and conserve their supplies, but I can't keep it going. The wood's disappearing faster than I can burn it, and the cold just keeps coming through the walls." Callum studied the man who had mocked his construction methods for months. Rafferty looked defeated, exhausted, beyond measure. "You can stay here until the storm breaks." "How are you keeping warm? I don't see a fire. I don't see massive wood stores. This doesn't make sense," Callum explained while Rafferty slowly recovered from his exposure. He described thermal mass, earth insulation, baseline ground temperature, the difference between heating air and heating mass. Rafferty listened with the focused attention of someone whose survival depends on understanding. "You're telling me this dirt around your metal shell is what's keeping you alive?" "The earth maintains constant temperature. I add small amounts of heat every few days to raise interior temperature above that baseline. The mass stores the heat and releases it slowly. A log cabin is the opposite. Thin walls, air gaps, constant heat loss. You're fighting, losing battle." Rafferty looked around the interior with new appreciation. "I called this a tomb, called you a fool for building it. You weren't alone in that assessment. I was wrong. This is the smartest thing anyone in this settlement has built." Rafferty set down his coffee cup, hands finally steady. "Can others come here?" "The Reeds are struggling. The Johnsons, too. Wilhelm's cabin is overcrowded and burning through his wood supply trying to keep everyone warm." "How many people are we discussing?" "Maybe 15 total, if we count all the families barely holding on." Callum considered the space. His shelter was designed for 1 person, maybe 2 comfortably. 15 would be cramped but possible. More importantly, 15 bodies would generate significant heat themselves. "Tell them they're welcome. Bring what food and blankets they can carry. Leave the cabins to freeze." They came in groups over the next 2 days. Wilhelm Hoffman arrived first with his wife and 3 children, having sent word to the other families. The Reeds came next, Thomas carrying his youngest daughter through drifts that reached above her head. The Johnsons, the Carmichaels, even 2 bachelor trappers who had been wintering in crude shelters that were now completely buried. Callum's small shelter became a refuge for 17 people. The space was cramped. Adults sat shoulder to shoulder along the curved walls. Children slept in piles on the floor. Privacy was non-existent, but everyone was warm. The gathered body heat of 17 humans added significant thermal energy to the space. Callum burned no fires for 3 days after the families arrived. Interior temperature, which had been maintaining around 57 degrees with just him, climbed to 65 degrees from body heat alone. Wilhelm Hoffman spent hours examining the construction, understanding finally what Callum had built. "The metal is just waterproofing. The real structure is the earth itself. The earth is insulation and thermal battery both," Callum confirmed. "It stores heat, releases it slowly, and provides a baseline that outside conditions can't easily overcome." Thomas Reed, who had dismissed the shelter as excessive effort, now saw the value of those 4 months of construction. A week to build a cabin that fails in extreme conditions, or 4 months to build shelter that keeps 17 people alive when their cabins couldn't keep 1 family warm. I chose poorly. The children adapted quickly, treating the crowded shelter as an adventure rather than a hardship. They played games, told stories, and slept peacefully through nights that would have been miserable in the cabins their families had abandoned. The adults dealt with the close quarters through cooperation and shared gratitude for survival. Donald Rafferty appointed himself the shelter's historian, documenting everything. He took notes on construction methods, asked detailed questions about materials and techniques, sketched diagrams of the masonry heater and ventilation system. Others need to know this. This knowledge could save lives across the entire territory. "I'll share everything freely," Callum said. "I'm not trying to profit from it. You already have profited. You're alive and comfortable, while those of us who mocked you nearly froze to death in our so-called proper cabins." The blizzard finally began weakening on day 19. The wind dropped first, declining from howling fury to intermittent gusts. The snow tapered from blinding whiteout to light flurries. Temperature remained brutally cold, but the worst had passed. Callum burned a fire on day 19 for the first time in 72 hours. 6 logs to celebrate survival and to warm the crowded interior into genuine comfort rather than mere habitability. The masonry heater, surrounded by 17 grateful people, radiated heat that felt like salvation. Outside, the abandoned cabin stood frozen and dark, monuments to construction methods that worked adequately in normal conditions but failed catastrophically when tested by extreme weather. Inside Callum's earth-sheltered dwelling, 17 people lived through the worst blizzard in Montana Territory's recorded history while consuming less firewood than a single family would have burned in their conventional cabin. The storm broke completely on day 22. Families emerged from Callum's shelter into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted in massive formations, burying familiar landmarks, creating new contours across the valley. The abandoned cabins were nearly invisible under accumulated snow, their cold interiors undamaged but uninhabitable without days of fire to restore warmth. Wilhelm Hoffman organized the return efforts, coordinating wood distribution from Callum's remaining supply to help families restart their cabin fires. The work took 3 days. Men tunneled through drifts to reach their homes, cleared doorways, broke through ice seals, and gradually coaxed frozen structures back to livability. But something fundamental had changed in how the settlement viewed construction and survival. Thomas Reed announced he would build an earth-sheltered structure before next winter. The Johnsons asked for detailed plans of Callum's design. Even the bachelor trappers discussed partnering on a shared shelter built into the hillside near their trap lines. Donald Rafferty became the most vocal convert. He spent a week at Callum's shelter after the other families returned home, documenting every detail of the construction. He measured wall thickness, sketched the masonry heater's internal channels, calculated thermal mass volume, and recorded Callum's observations about temperature behavior. "This needs to spread beyond our settlement," Rafferty said. "Homesteaders across the entire territory are building cabins that will kill them when weather turns severe." Over the following months, as spring gradually displaced winter, word spread through the territory about the buried shelter that had saved 17 lives. Trappers passing through stopped to examine the structure. Homesteaders planning to establish new claims asked questions about construction techniques. Even the Army sent an engineer from Fort Benton to study the design. Callum shared everything. He explained thermal mass principles to anyone who asked. He demonstrated his masonry heater design. He discussed earth berming, ventilation, moisture control, and the physics of heat retention. Some listeners understood immediately. Others remained skeptical despite the dramatic evidence. By summer of 1841, 5 new earth-sheltered structures were under construction within 30 miles of Callum's original dwelling. The designs varied based on available materials and builder skill, but all incorporated the core principles: substantial thermal mass, earth insulation, minimal exposed surface area, strategic orientation for solar gain. The technique spread beyond Montana Territory. Traders carried descriptions to Oregon. Settlers moving west incorporated earth-sheltering principles into their planning. By the 1850s, scattered across the frontier, dozens of structures stood that traced their design ancestry back to Callum MacLeod's response to winter's cruelty. Callum lived in his shelter until 1853, when he sold his land and moved to the Willamette Valley. He had spent 13 winters in the earth-bermed dwelling, proving year after year that the initial 4 months of construction had been worthwhile. The structure outlasted him, serving multiple owners through the decades, standing solid while conventional cabins were built and rebuilt. The legacy lived not in monuments or historical markers, but in the families who survived brutal winters because someone had thought differently about heat and cold. The impossible had become routine, validated by survival when conventional construction failed, ensuring that knowledge of earth and thermal mass would persist long after the man who proved it had moved on to a gentler climate.